Imagine a courtroom where the defendant is a corpse, not a metaphor. A body propped in silk, ringed by candles, eyes collapsed. In 897, Pope Stephen hauled his predecessor Formosus from the grave, dressed him in papal robes, and put him on trial. Witnesses swore. A deacon answered for the dead. The verdict sliced off blessing fingers and flung the body into the Tiber. You think medieval religion was gentle? Think again. This wasn't justice. It was vengeance under lights. By the end, you'll watch popes topple, mobs riot, and Rome choke on sins. Let's plunge into the twisted truth. You want chaos? Rome in 897 was a knife fight in a church. The city swayed between feuding nobles, mercenary bands, and rival emperors who treated the papacy like a crown factory. Formosus had died in April 896, buried at St. Peter's, and already his memory split Rome like a fault line. One faction backed Emperor Lambert of Spoleto and his formidable mother Agiltrude. The other looked north to Arnulf of Carinthia, the hard man from beyond the Alps. Coronations meant legitimacy, and legitimacy meant armies, taxes, and land. So popes were not merely priests. They were kingmakers with oil on their hands. After Arnulf's sudden paralysis on campaign and a Roman backlash, Lambert's circle surged. Pope Stephen, dependent on Spoleto goodwill, needed to erase everything Formosus had done, especially the imperial crown he placed on Arnulf. Imagine modern politics if inaugurations could be retroactively deleted by a hostile Supreme Court, complete with a spectacle trial streamed from a cathedral. That was the mood. Fear, payback, and incense. So Stephen gave Rome a show. Not a discreet decree, a public ritual. He ordered the tomb opened, the corpse lifted, and the theater prepared within the Lateran, where councils met and verdicts shaped empires. If you think this already crosses the line, wait until the curtain rises. Here's the name that haunted them: Formosus. Before he was a corpse in robes, he was a missionary and diplomat, Bishop of Porto, the port city's old seat. He negotiated with Bulgarians, argued theology, and made enemies with equal skill. In 876, Pope John VIII excommunicated him amid accusations of ambition and meddling. 2 years later, Formosus was absolved and returned. By 891, he himself wore the tiara. He crowned the young Lambert of Spoleto co-emperor in 892. Then, as politics shifted and fear of Spoleto power spread, he invited Arnulf into Italy and crowned him emperor in early 896. Here's the charge that would later become a weapon: the ancient canon against translating bishops from one see to another. Formosus had moved from Porto to Rome as pope. Was it a technical violation or a cudgel opponents could swing when convenient? In a city where scripture could be wielded like a dagger, that distinction scarcely mattered. To Stephen's side, Formosus wasn't just wrong. He was dangerous because his acts made enemies look legitimate. And legitimacy is the one thing factions cannot share. So the case file began to write itself, long before the grave was opened. Perjury, ambition, illegal translation, betrayal. It would be the most grotesque attempt at retroactive justice the medieval world had seen. Next, the body enters the room. You thought new popes brought peace. Not Stephen. He stepped into office late in 896 like a man walking onto a stage already on fire. Rome whispered that his seat depended on Lambert's favor and Agiltrude's shadow, a queen mother who knew how to twist the city's nerves. Stephen's problem was simple. As long as Formosus's acts stood, Lambert's enemies still wore halos of legality. Erase Formosus, and you erase crowns, appointments, and the entire paper trail that propped up rivals. But Stephen didn't choose the clean method. Letters, counsels, careful arguments. He chose theater. He convened a synod in the Lateran early in 897 and announced the defendant. Not a bishop, not a cardinal, a corpse. Picture the hush when attendants carried in a withered body, set it upright on a throne, and laced dying bones into brocade sleeves. This wasn't just about law. It was about humiliation, about dragging a memory through the streets and breaking it on a bench. In modern terms, imagine impeaching a dead president's portrait live on television, then shredding the Constitution on air. The crowd came to gawk, the clergy came to tremble, and Stephen came to win. The charges were ready, the ritual was set, the horror just beginning. The exhumation itself was a crime scene in slow motion. Sextons cracked the tomb at St. Peter's, hauled up the swollen, darkened remains, and tried to make a pope from a ruin. They washed what they could. They wrapped what they could not. They pulled silk over slippage skin, fitted gloves over clawed hands, and placed the pallium as if dignity could be stitched. A papal tiara crowned a skull whose jaw needed binding to stay shut. When attendants carried the body into the hall, candles hissed, and the smell, earth, rot, and old incense, climbed the rafters. They seated Formosus on a throne. A deacon stood nearby to speak the answers the dead could not. This detail matters. It meant the trial was not pretending, it was asserting. By giving the dead a voice only to overrule it, Stephen turned justice into puppetry. Think of a modern prosecutor arguing with a mannequin while a stadium cheers. Absurd, yes. But the absurd often hides violence. On the table lay the script, illegal translation from Porto, perjury, betrayal of vows, and the ultimate sin, crowning the wrong emperor. The judge glared, the corpse sagged, the crowd leaned in. Next came the questions. The hall was the Lateran's nerve center, where councils hammered doctrine and kings sought blessing. Turning it into a mortuary courtroom told everyone in Rome exactly who owned the past and who might own the future. Then came the interrogation, a ritualized beating masked as procedure. Stephen's voice rose, sharp, theatrical. Why did you, being Bishop of Porto, usurp the Roman see? The deacon, playing the corpse, mumbled the scripted answers. Witnesses stepped forward with oaths and stories. Some were honest. Many were terrified. All understood the message. Stephen accused Formosus of violating the canons by translating from Porto to Rome, of perjuring himself, and of plotting against rightful rulers. He raked through earlier controversies, old excommunications, old absolutions, like a man digging up not one grave, but a cemetery. The point was not discovery, it was degradation. Theatrics dripped from every move. At one moment, attendants lifted the corpse's hand as if to swear. At another, the jaw cloth slipped and had to be retied. Laughter rippled, quickly strangled by fear. Imagine a show trial where the defendant cannot breathe, yet still somehow manages to lose. Modern courts would throw out the entire circus. Medieval Rome clapped. The prosecution's closing line was simple. A dead man had sabotaged the living. To fix politics, they would fix the past. Everyone knew the verdict was already inked. The question was how cruel the punctuation would be. It arrived like a hammer. The verdict detonated like thunder. Guilty on every charge. Stephen declared Formosus's papacy null from the start. Void, rotten, the work of an impostor bishop who never should have left Porto. That one sentence was dynamite. If Formosus was never truly pope, then every act he performed was a fraud. Ordinations, bishops, judgments, even imperial crowns. Imagine waking to find your law degree retroactively erased and your entire career labeled a crime. Then the ritual mutilation. Attendants seized the right hand, the one that blessed, and with knives cut off 3 fingers, used for making the sign of the cross. They stripped the corpse of papal insignia, tore the pallium, and declared him deposed, though he was already dead. Clergy ordained by Formosus were suddenly told their sacraments might not count. Whole dioceses felt the floor tilt. An earthquake of paperwork followed, because theology has ledgers and ledgers have armies. But the real malice was visual. The fingers on the floor said more than any canon. They said, "We own your memory. We own your miracles. We own you." And the crowd understood. The hall stank of power, sweat, and fear. The final insult was still to come, carried by the river that cuts Rome in 2. You thought dumping the law was enough. They dumped the body too. At first, attendants shoved Formosus into a common grave. That should have ended it. Anonymous dirt to smother a scandal. But contempt rarely knows when to stop. Soon after, the corpse was dragged out again and hauled across the city to the Tiber. Witnesses remembered the hush along the riverbank, the slap of water against stone. They heaved the body in. Silence, then a slow bobbing, as if even death resisted the verdict. This wasn't a purification. It was a message. The Tiber will carry away what we forbid you to remember. In modern terms, delete the account, purge the archives, pretend it never happened. Except Rome remembers like an elephant with a grudge. Fishermen spoke of a corpse washing ashore near the mill race. Monks whispered of recovery and reburial. Stories swelled. Some swore the body performed miracles, others that the river itself rose in fury. Whether legend or truth, the effect was real. The more Stephen tried to erase Formosus, the more the city saw a martyr where a scapegoat should have been. And martyrs don't stay quiet. They start crowds. Those crowds were coming for Stephen next. The backlash hit like summer lightning. Rome is a city of alleys where news runs faster than soldiers, and the talk was simple. The Pope had tried a corpse and lost to a river. Clergy ordained by Formosus feared for their status. Ordinary Romans were disgusted. Nobles smelled weakness. Within months, the mood curdled into riot. Stephen was seized, stripped of his vestments, and thrown into a cell. There, according to later accounts, he met the same fate as so many prisoners of frightened regimes. He was strangled, likely in July or August 897. No ceremony, no last speech, just rope and silence. Imagine a CEO who stages a televised purge and is fired by security the next quarter. That was Stephen's hard landing. His downfall didn't heal Rome. It exposed every fracture. Because when a city learns that even the dead can be put on trial, it also learns that no office is safe, no oath sacred, no verdict permanent. Stephen's enemies cheered his corpse court, then watched the door swing on its hinges and smash him on the way back. Chaos wasn't over. It was multiplying. And the corpse of Formosus was not done shaping the living. The next popes had to choose, double down on the horror or reverse it and admit Rome had stared into a mirror and screamed. The pendulum swung back with dizzy speed. Theodore II, Pope for a few weeks late in 897, called a synod that annulled the Cadaver Synod, restored Formosus's acts, and crucially, brought the body back to St. Peter's for honorable burial. It was a band-aid laid on a knife wound, but it mattered. Soon after, John IX convened councils in Rome and Ravenna in 898 to confirm the annulment and to ban trials of the dead. Think about that. They had to write a law saying, "Stop prosecuting corpses." John also ordered the records of Stephen's synod burned. In a world that revered parchment, that was a funeral for a verdict. Bishops ordained by Formosus breathed again. Emperor-making remained an open contest, but at least the sacramental books could stop bleeding. If you want a modern comparison, imagine a Supreme Court not only reversing a decision, but ordering every copy of it shredded, then passing a rule that nobody can sue a portrait ever again. For a moment, Rome exhaled. But moments don't last in a city addicted to power. The next twist would prove that even laws against the past cannot hold when the future belongs to men who turn memory into a weapon. You thought the ban would stop them. Enter Sergius III, elected in 904, hard-eyed, backed by the new Roman strongman Theophylact and his circle. Sergius had been a judge at the Cadaver Synod and never hid his contempt for Formosus. Once power tilted his way, he revived Stephen's condemnation and made sure Formosus's supporters felt it. Clerics ordained by the dead pope were pressured to be reordained. Certain bishops lost their sees. Rome slid into what later chroniclers called the Dark Age of the Papal House, when great families treated St. Peter's like a fortress and the papal tiara like a prize ring. Modern writers would call it capture, institutions bent around private hands. Gossip from later sources embroidered the era with tales of scandal and bedroom politics. But the core truth is simpler and uglier. Sergius turned a theological quarrel into a loyalty test, and memory into law. The Cadaver Synod had not ended with a river. It had infected the bloodstream. By the time Rome staggered into the next century, people did not speak of doctrine first. They spoke of which corpse your loyalties depended on. And the city learned a habit it never quite forgot: try the past, punish the present, and dare the future to object. Here's the real engine under the floorboards: imperial politics. Formosus had crowned Lambert of Spoleto, then turned to Arnulf of Carinthia when Spoleto power threatened to swallow the papacy. Arnulf entered Italy, routed enemies, and in February 896 was crowned emperor by Formosus. Days later, he was struck by sudden paralysis. Campaigns stalled, army drifted, Rome flipped. Lambert and Agiltrude re-entered the city with a smile that meant payback. Stephen owed them. The Cadaver Synod was their dream trial, a way to say Arnulf's crown never existed. His charters were smoke, and Lambert's claim stood radiant and untouched. It was not merely church law hair-splitting about translating bishops. It was about who owned Italy. If you control coronations, you mint legitimacy. If you mint legitimacy, you hire mercenaries and buy loyalty. Think of a central bank for power, with oil instead of ink. Stephen's courtroom was a mint. That is why every gesture mattered: the silk, the throne, the cut fingers, the river. Symbols print currency. Currency pays soldiers. Soldiers decide history. Strip away the incense and you can read the ledger lines. The trial was simply an invoice sent to the dead and paid by the living. The next pages were written in blood. The ordination crisis turned terror into policy. If Formosus had never been a real pope, what about the priests he ordained, the bishops he consecrated, the sacraments they performed, marriages, baptisms, confessions? Stephen's synod implied a sacramental domino effect, a paperwork apocalypse. For ordinary Romans, it felt like someone yanked the floorboards of salvation. Was your wedding valid? Did your child's baptism count? Theologians scrambled for a way out, leaning on the idea that sacraments do not depend on the personal holiness of the minister, but on intention and the Church's grace. Still, fear is louder than doctrine. Stories spread of clergy forced to seek reordination, of bishops sitting in limbo while factions weighed their pasts. Compare it to a software update that bricks half the city's phones, then tells you to download a patch from the guys who broke it. John 9's reversal tried to quiet the panic. Sergius later soaked it in gasoline. If you want to feel the temperature, listen to the silence in surviving letters. Tight language, nervous edges, careful half-sentences that hint at careers balancing on the blade. The Cadaver Synod didn't just humiliate one corpse, it threatened a chain of souls. That is why Rome still whispers about it. Let's address the whispers and the ink. Our knowledge comes from chroniclers who loved drama almost as much as power. Flodord in Rheims, later Liutprand of Cremona, defenders like Auxilius who wrote to vindicate Formosus. Some details may be sharpened by outrage, but the spine of the story stands. The corpse was exhumed, dressed, tried, mutilated, and tossed into the river. Stephen fell soon after. Reversals followed. Sergius revived the condemnation. The legend that the Tiber returned Formosus to shore reads like a miracle tailor-made for a city craving a saint. Miracle or metaphor, the effect was identical. Crowds raging for the dead and against the living. When you sort sources, you can feel the heat bleeding through parchment. It is the heat of men writing with knives close by. Think of modern op-eds written while the newsroom is being raided. Bias is inevitable. So is the gravity of truth when multiple enemies tell the same skeleton of events. Rome collected bones and made meaning. It still does. And the Cadaver Synod remains the city's purest parable about what happens when politics crawls into the tomb and calls it justice. Next, we step from the archive back into the hall. One last look at the stage and the stains it left behind. We began in a courtroom from hell, with a corpse seated on a throne and a city breathing through its teeth. You have seen silk stretched over decay, fingers sliced from a blessing hand, and a body pitched into the Tiber as if memory could drown. You have watched a pope turned into a prop, a ritual converted into a public beating, and the law retooled into theater. What did it buy? For a few months, it bought satisfaction. Then it bought ropes and prison bars for Stephen himself. Rome paid in fear, in forged certainties, in sacraments shadowed by doubt. From the first crack of the tomb to the last gasp in a cell, the Cadaver Synod mapped a truth about power. Rulers do not merely fight opponents, they fight the past. They fight paperwork, crowns, and signatures. Formosus crowned 2 emperors and tried to keep the papacy from being swallowed by one family. Stephen served another family and used the language of faith to burn a hole through his enemy's legacy. Theodore II and John IX tried to stitch the hole shut with councils, and for a heartbeat it held. Then Sergius III came with stronger thread and sewed a different pattern: loyalty tests, purges, and renewed condemnation. The past did not sleep. It learned new nightmares. Here's the uncomfortable mirror. We prize archives, recordings, court transcripts, and sworn oaths because they anchor us to something steadier than rage. But even now, we rewrite. We erase tweets, scrub hard drives, edit footage, and declare yesterday invalid when it chills today's blood. We do not dig up bodies and sit them on chairs, but we do resurrect scandals and stage trials of ghosts. Medieval Rome only made the metaphor literal. That is why the scene shocks us. It is our habit exposed, stripped of politeness. Remember the ordination panic. It felt like theology. It was also logistics. Invalidate one man and you threaten 10,000 acts performed in his name. Marriages, baptisms, absolutions, human lives built on signatures suddenly trembled. That is the cruel arithmetic of institutional vengeance. You never hit only your target. You shatter the floor and everyone falls a little. John 9 tried to bolt the floor back down. Sergius tugged the bolts free to test who would kneel. Tell me that does not feel familiar. We know this game even if our robes are different. There is another lesson hiding in the stench of that hall. Rituals protect us until the moment they become weapons. A trial is a ritual. So is burial. So is coronation. So is a signature on a page. When ritual is forced to carry the weight of revenge, it cracks, and the pieces cut indiscriminately. The cadaver synod was a cracked ritual held together by thread and will. It solved nothing. It scarred a century. It became shorthand for the day Rome placed a mirror in front of itself and screamed. Imagine the faces that day. The young cleric forced to read answers for a jaw that could not move. The old bishop who felt his own ordination wobble. The fisherman who later watched a body drift and wondered what justice meant if water could return a verdict. Imagine a mother in Rome clutching her child and asking whether the baptism counted. Imagine a soldier paid by Lambert cheering in the hall, then ducking a riot 6 weeks later. History is not made by abstract nouns. It is made by stomachs churning, by hands shaking, by eyes that refuse to look away, and by those that cannot bear to look at all. So what do we carry away from the cadaver synod? First, that institutions built on fear will weaponize even the dead to secure the living. Second, that memory resists punishment. Throw a body into a river, and someone will whisper that the river brought it back. Third, that law without humility becomes theater, and theater devours its actors. Rome learned it the hard way when Stephen's rope tightened. We started with a corpse in a courtroom. We end with a question that should haunt any age that loves performances. What modern custom will future generations find monstrous when they replay our footage? What ritual will they point to and say, "There, that is when they chose spectacle over mercy"? Will it be the public shaming wrapped as accountability? The permanent erasures passed as progress? Or something even colder that we cannot yet name? If this journey through Rome's darkest trial shook you, tell me. Comment the part that shocked you the most. Subscribe for more brutally honest history, like if you're glad you weren't born in the Dark Ages. And remember, justice is a ritual only as strong as the mercy that steadies its hand. Without mercy, we are always one ambition away from seating a corpse and calling it law.